When it comes to the question of brain retraining and ME-CFS or long COVID or other related conditions, broadly speaking, there exist two camps. One camp says that ME-CFS is only a hypersensitive nervous system. All of the symptoms are being created by the brain. There's nothing else going on in the body. And all you need to do in order to recover is practice brain retraining, and that basically that's the end of the story. The other camp states that brain retraining is pseudoscientific, quackery, an area filled with charlatans who are just preying on the vulnerable, and basically you should keep away from it at all costs, and that it's a total waste of time, if not dangerous. In this video, I'm going to talk about why I think that both of these camps make some really important mistakes, and I'm going to share with you what I think is a more accurate and balanced way to consider the potential role and usefulness of neuroplasticity in ME-CFS and related conditions. But first, my name is Patrick Usher, and I am author of the book Understanding ME-CFS and Strategies for Healing, in which I break down some of the latest, most exciting research into ME-CFS and long COVID, and talk about some of the treatment strategies that I have tried in order to improve my quality of life. The links for that book are down below. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to consider each camp separately. I'm going to give an overview of what they say, and then I'm going to discuss why I think that point of view has some mistakes. And then once we've done that for both camps, at the end I will summarize and describe how I think that this whole area can be considered in a more objective and accurate way. So when it comes first of all to the pro-brain retraining camp, and in particular the most dominant strand of it, which says that ME-CFS is only a hypersensitive nervous system and all you need to do is brain retraining, etc., etc. I've already done a range of videos in which I describe what I think are the mistakes made by this position. However, basically it ignores nearly all of the research into ME-CFS, which has instead painted a picture of an illness with a range of biomedical problems, and in fact not just that, but a range of biomedical problems which interrelate and drive each other in a series of vicious cycles. And this way I'm particularly talking about the work of Klaus Wirth and Carmen Scheibenbogen, which I describe in detail in my book. But the important thing to understand is that all the other problems that can exist in ME-CFS, like the low blood volume, some patients having 1 litre or more less blood than they should have, like autoantibodies which get into the blood vessel tissues, the heart tissues, into the cells and actually reduce the function of these areas, the microclots which condense the blood and make it thick and even darker in colour and reduce the tissue oxygenation further, the cellular issues. I did a video just recently about how these can actually create muscle tissue death during post-exertional malaise. All of these things, which initially seem random, are actually part of a series of interlinking vicious cycles. What the brain retraining camp is leaving out is first of all any reference to any of these issues, but also leaving out how these secondary dysfunctions actually become embedded and then maintain themselves. So even if you come along, and even if you say, yes, there's a hypersensitive nervous system, and even if you're working on that, it's an open question whether or not these other issues will respond positively as a result of doing brain retraining. They might, because the sensitive nervous system is one part of the vicious cycles, so perhaps breaking that part of it will help the others to improve. Or perhaps the other issues are so embedded, so powerful, so far advanced, that you only have quite a minimal impact on them by working on the hypersensitive nervous system part of the vicious cycle. And so, although sometimes people do recover from ME-CFS by using brain retraining, as we know from many anecdotal reports, there are also those who do not. And the response of the brain retraining coaches will just be that you're not doing it enough, you're not doing it well enough, you haven't done it for long enough. But actually, these people may well be practicing the various neuroplasticity exercises. They might well be practicing them to the letter, because these other secondary issues have become so strong and so embedded, they can't actually make progress. They still crash, they still get post-exertional malaise. One of the main problems, or the biggest problem with this first camp, is that it ignores a range of biomedical factors as identified by the research, and it therefore portrays a very inaccurate view of what ME-CFS is to patients, but it also ignores the way in which these biomedical problems are actually part of a vicious cycle that perpetuates itself and doesn't allow for the fact that those vicious cycles could actually keep people ill no matter how much brain retraining they do. And when we consider that often large sums of money are being handed over in order for ME-CFS and long COVID patients to be told that there's nothing physically wrong with them and it's all of their symptoms are created by the brain, this is a hugely problematic and troublesome narrative, which I think is not just misleading people, it can be dangerous in some cases, particularly when people are more severe. So that's the first camp, and those are my issues with it. When it comes to the second camp, which is saying this is a waste of time, it's pseudoscientific, this is a field dominated by charlatans. Well, to be fair to this camp, if we're just reacting to the first camp, that's not it is an understandable position to hold, because it is ludicrous for people to say that ME-CFS is only a hypersensitive nervous system, and in that context, if people are charging thousands of dollars in order to sell a program which states that, you could argue that that is preying on the vulnerable. So I have some sympathies with that position. However, it's actually a mistake simply react to the first camp. Instead, we need to think about how can neuroplasticity be considered in a more accurate and objective and balanced way in relation to ME-CFS. Because while the first camp has blind spots, the second camp does also. And the first blind spot of this camp is that it ignores the fact that some people actually do recover from ME-CFS using brain retraining. Now, to my mind, if someone recovers in that way, it's something to be curious about, it's something to be interested in, it's something to ask, well, why has that worked? It's something to have a scientific mind about, basically. Whereas what tends to happen in this anti-brain retraining camp is they will kind of put down the person who's recovered. They may even say things like, I don't really think you ever had ME-CFS. Maybe it was just stress or anxiety. They'll say things like that, which is a rather ironic reversal. The doubting doctor's approach towards ME-CFS patients generally. So these ME-CFS patients are actually doing that to former ME-CFS patients. And I think actually we should believe people's experience, and when I have watched or read about the many testimonials that exist anecdotally of people who have used brain retraining in order to recover, it's quite clear that they usually did have ME-CFS from the nature of the symptoms that they describe. So I believe them. And the question then becomes, well, why? We need to be curious about that. We need to think about how could working on a maladaptive stress response in the brain actually facilitate someone's recovery when we consider the nature of ME-CFS as a whole, including all of its vicious cycles. So that's the first blind spot of the anti-brain retraining camp, is that it doesn't want to think in an open and curious and scientific way about why some people recover. The second issue is that it just doesn't consider neuroplasticity as valid in the first place. And this, from a scientific perspective, is also a mistake. We know that neuroplasticity is used in other illnesses, in other health problems, like, for example, recovery after stroke. So some people, they've lost the use of a limb, and through intensive neuroplastic exercises over months, they can sometimes actually create new neurons in the brain to enlist those neurons to allow for movement in that limb again. And neuroplasticity is used for that, it's used for ADHD, it's used for a range of conditions. Indeed, the very fact that the brain is neuroplastic is a well-established scientific fact. It's the basis of how the brain works. It changes in response to experience and specific exercises. So there's a kind of dismissal even of its potential usefulness, even though it is something that has been used without people saying this is ridiculous in other conditions. So the question becomes, how can neuroplasticity be applied more accurately to the problems that are going on in ME-CFS? Now, this is where we come to the fact that there are a range of MRI studies of ME-CFS brains which show specific abnormalities. And we're getting even more of an idea of this thanks to recent research from Australia, which is using quite advanced kinds of MRI technology. But these are showing a range of things. They're showing issues and problems in the basal ganglia, the more autonomic part of the brain, which tends to be inflamed or increased in size. We see problems in executive function regions of the brain, for example, to do with focus or concentration, or other parts of the brain to do with the prefrontal cortex. Those areas tend to be smaller and weaker. We see things like amygdala function, which is to do with fear, fight or flight, tends to get larger. So these are all issues which actually correspond to the idea of a traumatized brain, a sensitized brain, a hypersensitive nervous system. And so the question becomes, how can we actually correct those issues, and could we do so using neuroplasticity? And to my mind, neuroplastic programs aimed at dampening down the stress response are actually very well suited to dealing with these kinds of issues that are coming up in the scans. And basically what I would ask to people who are dead set against brain retraining is, given these kinds of problems that are coming up, which are showing issues that clearly would correlate to a sensitized brain, well, how else are you going to try and address those problems? If not through specific exercises, neuroplastic exercises aimed at dampening down the stress response. A very obvious example of this relates to the sensitivities, the sensory sensitivities that people get with ME-CFS, like the light sensitivity, noise sensitivity, smell sensitivity, even electromagnetic hypersensitivity sometimes. What's going on there? Why are people getting those sensitivities? These sensitivities are processed in the limbic brain. They're not, when someone is suddenly more sensitive to chemical smells, the problem is not with their nose. It's the part of them which processes the smell, and that's within the limbic brain, and it's become sensitized. That's why the smell is so strong and intense. And so, that shows us that there is a maladaptive neuroplastic problem going on in ME-CFS. And so why wouldn't we be curious about how to actually potentially address that? So those are my issues with the second camp. It's not curious about why it is that some people do recover. And to be clear, we should also be curious about why some people don't recover. And it also just is dismissive of the whole topic of neuroplasticity. It doesn't take into account that this is used in other areas with success. It doesn't want to think in a kind of, objective way about how neuroplasticity could be adapted to what we see as going wrong in the ME-CFS brain. And just to be curious about that. And my feeling is it does those things because it is reacting so strongly to the first camp. It's framing the whole question simply as a response to the first camp, which is not a helpful way to proceed with this. And so in that way, it actually has its own groupthink and kind of knee-jerk reactions to any discussion of this topic. And so really what this second camp is doing is it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Meanwhile, the first camp is also making some major mistakes. It is ignoring the biomedical research in the body of ME-CFS patients and what's going on elsewhere. It's ignoring the vicious cycles. It's not taking into account that someone might actually practice brain retraining, and because there are so many other vicious cycles embedded already in that patient, that actually the brain retraining doesn't help them beyond a certain point. And it's basically promulgating a view of ME-CFS that is just plain wrong and misleading and damages the perception of the illness, but also does not help patients who are grappling with trying to understand what's really going on with them. So I think that there's a different way of approaching this. There's a way in which you can understand that yes, there is a hypersensitive nervous system in ME-CFS. That's obvious. There is an autonomic dysregulation. But to understand how so many different factors are at play in perpetuating the illness pathophysiology, in what that illness pathophysiology actually is, and in how there are even other ways, illness mechanisms which play into and create the autonomic dysfunction, but that nevertheless we can use neuroplastic exercises to affect the part of the illness which is the negative neuroplastic state, the maladaptive neuroplastic state, and thereby influence one aspect of the overall vicious cycle. And for some people, as we have seen anecdotally, that may lead to recovery. For others, it might lead to a bit of improvement, and for some still not at all. But we need to understand, and patients have a right to understand, what their illness actually involves, and we need to have a more objective understanding of the potential of neuroplasticity for these conditions, and also not to dismiss it altogether, because there clearly is something going on in ME-CFS which does respond to neuroplastic interventions. So that's it for this video. I hope you found this interesting. I'd be curious to know about your thoughts on this, because this is a very polarized topic and it tends to raise heated discussions, but I'll be interested to hear what you think about this in the comments down below, and I will see you in the next video.